Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another session in which we are looking at foundations of sports and exercise psychology. In today's session, we want to look at the whole issue of motivation. And I think you would appreciate if you have any interest in sport or exercise, what an important topic is this is. You can imagine you're on a particular workout program. You have to get up 6 o'clock every morning. You went to bed late the night before. And what is it that allows you to roll out of bed, drag yourself out of bed, pull yourself together, and get to the gym early that morning before you start the day? And that's what we want to talk about today: motivation. Here are your learning objectives. You can pause this slide and go through these in more detail at a later time. So let's begin by giving a very simple definition of motivation. One simple definition that's often used is motivation is the process that initiates, guides, maintains goal-oriented behavior. It's a process that initiates, guides, and maintains goal-oriented behavior. Or you could simply say, motivation is what causes you to act. It's not a physical thing. It's not something that's tangible, but it's something within the inner construct of the human psyche that's going to cause a person to perform a particular action. Now, one of the things you can read or into or pick up from this definition is that when we talk about motivation, we're talking about the direction and the intensity of an effort that leads to behavior. So direction of effort will then speak to whether the person will actively engage in the behavior or seek it out. And intensity talks about what's the level of effort and energy that the person will bring to the particular task. So if I go back to that example we used at the beginning, you might roll out of bed, get down to the gym, but your effort levels may be low. Because your motivation levels are low for whatever reason. And so you're there in body, but you're not really putting a lot of effort because your motivation is low. And connected to this issue of effort is the whole issue of persistence. That ability to keep engaging in the task with the requisite amount of effort that will then lead to success. Why is it that some athletes and some individuals are able to be persistent in the face of very significant obstacles, whereas other persons seem to drop off fairly quickly? All of these things are important and questions and things we want to understand when we talk about motivation. So here on your screen, you see three highly successful athletes. I've tried to pull them from a diverse realm of sports. There you see LeBron James recently won his fourth NBA championship with the Lakers. Lionel Messi, considered one of the greatest footballers ever. And Serena Williams, also considered one of the greatest in her sports of tennis. Recently, Tom Brady just won his 7th Super Bowl. That's a record that far outstrips any other athlete that plays the quarterback position in American football. So when you look at these elite athletes, these world-class performers, the question we want to ask ourselves is what motivates these athletes? And as you think about this, I want you to recognize that some of the things that we can traditionally think about motivation may no longer apply at this stage of their career. So for example, we just said Tom Brady won his 7th Super Bowl. Well, he's a millionaire many times over, and his wife is also very well off. Recently, Serena Williams was estimated to have a net worth of 200 million US dollars. And another report actually says LeBron James just hit $1 billion US dollars as his net worth. So if you think about motivation as being money and financial rewards, well, it would seem to be that these individuals have no need for more money, yet they still seem highly motivated. And that allows us to talk about our first concept in motivation, types of motivation. And this is something that's pretty much agreed upon within psychology. And any basic text of psychology will highlight this to you. That when we talk about motivation, we describe two types of motivation. The first type relates to external rewards, and it's referred to as extrinsic motivation. It's motivation in which you perform an activity to earn a reward or to avoid punishment. Here, the thing that is motivating you is external to the individual. This is in contrast to intrinsic motivation, in which an individual is motivated to perform an activity for its own sake and just for the inherent sense of pleasure or self-worth one gets from the activity, or very personal rewards that only apply to the individual. If we dive a little deeper then, we can say examples of extrinsic motivation, which are often summarized by the carrot and the stick approach, the carrot being the reward and the stick being the punishment. Examples of extrinsic motivation would be participating in sports to get an award, a trophy, or monetary rewards. Cleaning up your room to avoid being reprimanded by your parents, as opposed to cleaning up your room just because you like the space clean. Competing in a contest to win a scholarship, or studying because you want to get the good grade. All of these would be examples of extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is something that seems to come from the inside. You play the sport because you actually enjoy playing the sport, not because of any external reward. You clean your room because you get a sense of pride and satisfaction, and you like to be in a clean environment. When you solve a problem, you just get some inherent satisfaction and joy from knowing that you solved the problem. Whether you get an A+ or B+ doesn't really make a difference to you. And you study things because you find them interesting and enjoyable, not simply because you want to get the degree and the piece of paper that comes at the end of 3 years. And so you can immediately see there's a very clear difference between the motivating factors in intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And this slide just summarizes that. Intrinsic motivation, because of the interest and enjoyment in the task itself. Purpose, growth, curiosity, passion, self-expression, fun. Extrinsic motivation, because of the outcome that comes from doing the task. Promotion, pay, benefits, prizes, winning, and also the avoidance of negative consequences like punishment or external criticism. Now, intrinsic motivation has been studied a lot. And one of the theories that's important for sports psychology is self-determination theory. And this is a theory of intrinsic motivation. It's part of the humanistic theories in psychology. And it describes the fact that humans and people have natural growth tendencies. And those growth tendencies are associated with three dynamics or three components of intrinsic motivation, known as autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And let me just play a little video to give you a sense of what those three things actually mean.
Our three basic needs are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. We've heard some things about them today, but I'm just going to briefly say what they are. For us, relatedness is feeling cared for and connected to others. It has to do with a sense of belonging, a feeling that you matter to the other people that are there. And relatedness is enhanced not just by people treating you warmly and including you, but it's also enhanced by your giving to them and you're being able to matter in their lives. That's part of what helps us feel connected. So it's not a one-way street in relatedness. It has to do with both. And again, we'll show evidence of that fact. Competence is really commonly studied in psychology. Most theories of psychology would probably agree with us on this one point, which is competence is essential to wellness, to feel effective in your environment, to have some sense of mastery of the things that are important to you. Very, very important, and environments can have a big impact on that experience. And then finally, relatedness, finally autonomy, which has been probably the most controversial, but also the most central of our psychological needs in the sense of research and our integrative mission, so to speak. Autonomy refers to behavior that is self-endorsed, that you agree with and find congruent within yourself. And so autonomy here means that you feel choiceful, self-initiating, and when you're fully autonomous, you're wholeheartedly behind the thing that you're doing. And again, because of that wholeheartedness, that's why performance tends to be better when you're acting out of autonomous motives.
So that was a little that was a little video that was taken from Psychological Talk, and I just want to now highlight, forgive that glitch in the PowerPoint there, just highlight what the person was saying there. So let's look at competence. I think that's the simplest to understand. Competence is the need to gain mastery, of that which you're doing. And you can understand that in sport. It's an intrinsic motivation in which you want to be good at what you do. So you want to be a good runner. You want to be a good football player. And beyond the macro sport, that can break down into simple tasks within your field. You want to be able to take good free kicks or be a good header of the football. All of that would describe competence. And that's coming from something inside of the person. Relatedness is a sense of belonging, a sense that you connect to other people in the world and that you contribute to their life and they contribute to your life. And therefore, that would be a big part of being a part of team sports. And even for individual sports, you're a part of a team with a coach and a group of people around you. And also you're a part of a fraternity. So for example, persons who play golf or tennis, they're connected in and they relate to the tennis fraternity or the golf fraternity. And finally, autonomy. That's the sense that you control your own life. You have the ability to make your own choices and you aren't being controlled by others. This is something you want to do and you put passion behind it. So these are the three aspects of self-determination theory. And because they represent intrinsic motivations, things that come from within the individual, one of the things you want to try and do when you're creating an environment of training is you want to create an environment that tap into these intrinsic factors. So for example, you want to give an athlete a sense that when they are engaged in training, when they're engaged in the decisions that they're making, they have some autonomy. So they get to choose the exercise that they want to do. They get to choose how they want to do it. And even though it might be fully, not fully their choice, they get opportunities to direct and consider the flow of their life. For example, what tournaments they might want to play, when they want to take part in them, and those types of things. Competence. How can the environment around give a sense of perceived competence? What kind of tasks and challenges are given to the athlete that allow them to have a sense of competence? And what are the external triggers that give the athlete the sense that they're developing competence? And finally, the whole issue of relatedness and the whole idea of creating a supportive environment that allows a person to feel that they're within a team context. And if we're able to do all of these things, the self-determination suggests, you then meet basic psychological needs, which produces a high sense of intrinsic motivation and self-determination and high levels of motivation to go out there and do well. You would realize then from just looking at that discussion that if you were to ask which type of motivation, extrinsic or intrinsic, is a better predictor of success, most of the research suggests that athletes who are intrinsically motivated tend to perform better in a number of ways. They tend to have higher levels of enjoyment and commitment to the sport in which they participate. They tend to participate actually more, they actually take part more, and they actually demonstrate higher levels of performance. And also, beyond the actual event, they practice more. And that practice then leads to improved performance. And of course, that improved performance will then reinforce the sense of competence. And you get a self-fulfilling prophecy and a virtuous cycle that feeds back upon itself and promotes even more engagement with this sport or the exercise. So let's ask a question though. Because so much of society and so much of training and athletics is often driven by extrinsic motivators, the promise of the reward or the threat of punishment, what do extrinsic rewards actually do? Now, some work that took place in the 70s that actually led to self-determination theory involved a group of college students. And they were asked to work on a particular puzzle, a complex puzzle, much like the one that you see on your screen before you. Now, half of the students were paid to work on the puzzle, and the other half were not paid to work on the puzzle. After a while, the students were given a short break, and they had the option to either continue working on the puzzle or do something else. They were left alone. They didn't realize they were being observed. The question I want to ask you is, which group do you think worked on the puzzle for longer when they were left alone? You would be surprised to know that actually the group that had not been paid ended up going back to the puzzle and engaging in the challenge. The group that had been paid pretty much put it down and moved on to something else. And from research like this and other work, it has been suggested that though extrinsic motivation may have a place, one of the things we have to be very aware of is extrinsic motivation has the potential to reduce intrinsic motivation. Let me say that again. Extrinsic motivation has the potential to undermine and reduce intrinsic motivation. And given that intrinsic motivation has been shown to be a predictor of better engagement and success in sport and exercise, that's something we want to try and avoid. And let me just say, studies like this have been carried out not just in the realm of sport, but in almost all of life, in terms of parenting, in terms of business. And it's generally agreed that extrinsic motivation can be harmful to intrinsic motivation. So what they've discovered is something that's called cognitive evaluation theory. That this ability of extrinsic motivation to undermine intrinsic motivation, it occurs in specific situations. One of the situations in which it occurs is if the person perceives the extrinsic motivator as designed to control them. You can understand if you go back to the whole issue of autonomy and making choice. If someone perceives that that extrinsic motivator is designed to control them, designed to limit their options, or designed to force them in a particular direction, then what it does is it decreases intrinsic motivation. And whenever they have a choice of their own, they choose not to engage in the act. Or if the extrinsic motivator is perceived as being critical and reduces their sense of competence, then it also is going to reduce intrinsic motivation. And so if the person perceives in any way, going back to self-determination theory, that it impacts their autonomy or it impacts their competence negatively, or somehow it's cutting them off from relatedness, then they're going to push back and their intrinsic motivation will decrease. On the other hand, if they actually perceive it as increasing their competence, like praise, or they don't feel a sense of threat to their autonomy, then extrinsic motivators can be useful and will not affect the intrinsic motivation of the individual. So one of the keys of this cognitive evaluative theory, that's why it's called cognitive evaluative theory, is how you perceive the extrinsic motivator is then going to determine what effect it will have on intrinsic motivation. So then the question becomes, how can we use extrinsic motivation? Well, we now feel that motivation operates on a continuum, moving from a motivation through extrinsic motivation and onto intrinsic motivation. And so while ultimately we would want everybody to be intrinsically motivated, extrinsic motivation can be used as a tool to move people along the continuum. So you have an individual who has no motivation whatsoever to go out and play tennis. Maybe they don't really understand the sport. They never thought it's something they would enjoy. There's no real motivation there. And extrinsic motivation could be used as a starting point just to get them going. If it's used skillfully, they might actually go out and play tennis and find that they enjoy it. And so you've now moved them a little bit along the continuum, and you're beginning to move them towards intrinsic motivation. So what external rewards can do is they can induce interest in participation when initially there's no interest. They can push people to acquire new skills and new knowledge. But once the person gets that skill, they have a sense of pride, like, hey, I've learned to serve. I know how to serve in a tennis match, or I can keep the ball on the court. And that now gives them the intrinsic push to keep going on. And also it can be used as a source of feedback and reinforcement that allows the person to learn and gain knowledge and increased competence. And so there's a continuum as you shift from what can be said in education to be teacher-centered learning towards learner-driven learning. In teacher-centered, it's fully focused on the teacher and how the teacher is motivating the student. But what you want to get to is a point where it's learner-driven, it's intrinsic. And that's why I say to you, I try to make this fun. I try to make it engaging for you. I ask you to think about these things and apply them to your love of sport and exercise. Because if you have that intrinsic motivation, then you're going to engage with this in a much more deep and meaningful way. In terms of using intrinsic motivation, well, if we think about self-determination theory, the key to using intrinsic motivation is to create the right environment. Create an environment that magnifies competence and autonomy, that focuses on the individual, that gives them a sense of choice. Prioritize successful experiences. Don't give them targets and goals that are beyond their competence, so that every time they come to practice, they fail. So think about a little child who's now learning to play football. If you give him a task that's too difficult, ask him to kick the football too far, eventually he will become demotivated because of a series of failures. Give him tasks that challenge him and allow him to be pushed a little bit beyond where he can get, and at which he gets some success. Also recognize individual difference. One person may have this level and another person may have another level. In terms of rewards, try not to focus on the results, because results are variable. Think about if you're doing athletic and one person is just naturally faster. Chances are that person will always win. That can be demotivating to the other person. But for the others in the group, you can encourage them on their effort. That was a really good effort. I really liked how you gave it your all and you focused on the form. And if you do that over time, they too will improve and they might also win the race. And where you can, give the participants some form of autonomy and allow them to make their own decisions. Okay, in the latter half of this presentation, we just want to touch upon a couple of views or different theories of motivation. Now, like much of psychology, motivated behavior can be considered as a trait in which it's primarily the characteristics of an individual. It can be considered as simply a result of the situation, in which depending upon the situation, you'll be motivated or not. And we have discussed how these two approaches can be limiting. And generally the one that's regarded within the realm of sports and exercise psychology is the interactional view. The motivated behavior is a result of an interaction between individual participant factors and also the situation in which they find themselves. And so like many other diagrams before, you would have seen something like this. You have an individual who has a certain personality, certain interests, certain goals, and they find themselves in a particular situation with a coach on a team at a certain time in the season. And those two things interact to produce a certain level of motivation. Let's give another more real world example. Here we have two swimmers, and they have different personalities, different traits. One swimmer is very much given to approval. They want to have the approval of others. The other swimmer is very much wary of being rejected by others. When do you think they will perform better or worse? Well, the one who's given to the approval of others, they tend to perform worse when they're operating alone. But if you put them on a relay team, they really do very well. On the other hand, the ones who are threatened by rejection of others, if they're asked to train alone, they tend to train very well. But often when they're training with others, there's a sense of threat and they can perform worse. And so this is just some research that has shown this trait by situation interaction and how it applies to motivation. Now, this has been amplified a bit inside of something called the need achievement theory of motivation. And this need achievement theory focuses upon 5 things: the personality of the individual, the situational factors the individual finds themselves in, how those two things interact to produce behavior and emotional reactions, and then how that affects the motivation to success. Now let's look at that in a diagram that explains all of this. So generally, when we talk about personality factors in the need achievement theory, we focus on 2 things. People are divided into 2 groups: achievement motivation, those who they are motivated by the desire to win and the desire to be successful. And then another group who's motivated by a fear of failure. That's why they're doing this stuff. They don't want to fail. And that's the thing that's motivating them. Then they come out into a particular situation. And that situation has 2 factors built into it: a probability of success. Is it a very difficult task? And what's the reward you get out of it? Will you get a big reward or a limited reward? And what you find out is you get the behavioral tendency. Are they going to seek out success and focus on pride, leading to performance enhancement? Or are they going to try to avoid failure and be afraid of being ashamed, and they might end up performing poorly? So let's break this down a little bit and just dive a little deeper. So like we said before, the personality is the fact that everybody is either motivated to achieve success or avoid failure. And you find that people operate on a continuum. And some are given more to achieving success, and some are given more to avoiding failure. And one of the things that seems to be observed is that persons who do well in sports, high achievers in sports, they really want to go after achieving success. They want to go after achieving success. That's a big driver inside of them. Now, that's not always the case. There are some athletes who hate to lose, who hate to fail, and that's the driver. But we're talking generally here, and generally we find that achievement motivation seems to be a big driver of competitiveness and doing well in successful athletes. And then you have the situational factors, as I mentioned. And here there's the probability of success and the incentive value. And what you find is that high achievers tend to seek out things that are challenging, things that will push them, but they know there's a good chance they can succeed. So they focus on like 50-50 opportunities. They're not just settling for something they know they will do well in. They go for something where they have a good chance of success, but they know they're being challenged. And they get a real sense of pride when they achieve that. On the other hand, low achievers, because they're afraid of failure, they look for two types of situations. One, where there's a high chance of success. So for example, if they have to race and they're a college athlete, they'll have no problem racing against a high school athlete, but they'll be much more wary of going against a national event. That will make them much more wary. On the other hand, they might seek out situations in which it's very difficult to do well. For example, national trials in which they're not expected to do well. Because then if they fail, no one would have expected them to succeed. And for these low achievers, the thing that they're driving them is they want to avoid the fear of shame. That's the thing that's driving them. And so that comes back here to these things, where you can see the high achievers, they're heading towards this probability of success. They seek out success, they focus on pride, and that leads to performance engagement. Low achievers, they tend to go the other route because they're trying to avoid failure. And this makes a difference, right? Think about those moments in a game that are critical. That moment when you have to take the risk and take the final shot or hit the final serve or do that difficult move. What you want is someone who's going for that success and willing to take that risk than seeking to avoid failure. So that's need achievement theory. Now let's also do attribution theory. Now attribution theory is another theory within sports, and it seeks to explain the cause of behavior. What do athletes say is the cause of their success or failure? And before we do that, here's a little short assessment. You can pause this screen, you can do the assessment, and then as you can see at the bottom, you can assess yourself. And what this is trying to do is determine whether when you make an evaluation of success or failure, you focus on internal factors present within yourself or external factors outside of you. So pause now and do the little survey. So attribution theory says that to explain events, we can either credit the situation or we can credit the individual. And that leads to the development of this model of 4 blocks put forward by Weiner, in which you have the locus of causality. Is it external, the situation, or is it internal, the individual? And then are the factors that you identify things that are there all the time, or are they things that can change? And when you do that and you create this matrix, what you find, it explains a large reason of why athletes point to success and failure. So something that's internal to the athlete and doesn't change is ability. So an athlete who says it's because of my ability, that's an internal stable factor. But an internal unstable factor is effort, because effort can change. What about an external factor that's stable? Well, that's task difficulty, right? Because that's fixed for the particular task you're engaging in. And an external factor that's unstable, well, that's luck. The referee made a bad call, or one of your players got injured and you were down to 10 men, or something like that. That would be external and unstable. And one of the things that has been found with athletes is athletes try to protect their ego. Good athletes, successful athletes protect their ego. So when they do well, they focus here on internal stable factors. But when they do badly, they tend to focus here on external factors, things that were beyond their control. And that somehow allows them to protect their ego and then go back and try again. You can understand that if somebody doesn't have that ability and they feel like they're constantly losing and it's their fault, in fact, they're blaming internally, they could develop learned helplessness. So high achievers attribute success to internal factors and attribute failure to external factors. Whereas low achievers do the opposite. They say that when they do well, oh, that was an easy opponent, or it was just luck. And when they fail, they blame themselves. And it's up to the role of the team around the person to create a good balance between these two factors. Because even for the high achiever, if they fail and they blame external factors, a good coach might want to say, well, yes, that's true, but there is this thing we could work on. So next time you encounter that external factor, you can counteract it. So here you can look through this chart and look and see how high achievers, what's their motivation, what are their attributes, and how it then affects the goals they pursue. And low achievers, they're not driven to achieve success. They're looking to avoid failure. So they assign success to unstable factors and all of the different things that happen here, and how it's then going to affect them moving forward. And so there you have it, introduction to motivation and its role in sports and exercise physiology. This is a very, very important topic because a lot of us might have giftings and skills, but depending upon the context in which people find themselves, despite those gifting and skills, they might not do well initially. And you have to use these strategies to keep their motivation high and to move them upon a growth path to achieve the goals that they've set for themselves. So that's all for today. I hope, again, you found this useful. And I encourage you to do further reading and look at further resources that you can find on the internet to fully understand motivation in sports and exercise psychology. Until we come together again, take care.